Welcome to the Bonhoeffer Project podcast. My name is Dan Leitz. I'm here with my co-host, Stephen Kimbrell, and I'm really excited about today's guest. We've had these conversations ongoing now for the last year, and there's these certain conversations that I really get excited to just engage in this conversation. And obviously with the Bonhoeffer Project, it is our aim to make disciple makers, turning leaders into disciple makers, finding, as Bill kind of coined the phrase, the fourth soilers. Obviously, Jesus coined it, but kind of latched onto it, Bill did. But today we've got on Justin Gravitt, and I was first introduced to Justin through a series of articles that I found on discipleship.org. And that's when I really started to kind of, I was diving into this Great Commission focus of the church that has been, to a certain extent, lost over the years. I appreciate, Justin, just kind of the influence that you've had. So I just wanted to take a second and introduce Justin Gravitt. Justin, welcome to the program. Good to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
Awesome. Same here. So what I like to start with, again, just when I speak to other disciple-making leaders, there's something that always intrigues me. I think one of the things that I've always found is I love a good testimony. But for me, again, there was a testimony for me in disciple making when I think I realized that I was focused on building a church that Jesus never called me to build. And I was woefully unintentional with disciple making. So that being said, Justin, kind of what's your story? How did disciple making become a passion and a focus for you that's, obviously influenced your books and your writings? How did that come about?
Yeah. Well, I was raised in the church unwillingly. I did not want to be there and was forced to go, and then went off to college and kind of was doing my own thing. And God really got a hold of my life during that time, just through sin and its impact of it just wasn't working for me, quite honestly, the way I was living. And there was a girl in my class that I was infatuated with, and she invited me to go to this group called the Navigators one night. And I had no idea it was even a religious group. I was like, yeah, I'm there. Let's,
you're going to be like, this is sweet.
Yeah, I went, and I was struck immediately by just a sense that people really knew God and they were genuinely seeking him in a way I'd never experienced before. And so I was really hungry for that. That was the very end of my sophomore year of college. And so literally 2 weeks left in the year. So the following year, I decided I'd keep going back. She went and studied overseas. That didn't work out. But God used her in my life and started to get involved. And then one of the guys began to disciple me. And that's really when I surrendered my life to Jesus, and really didn't know from there that this was a strange thing, that I was being discipled pretty much right away. And so God just got a hold of my life and kind of laid that foundation of disciple making in me at that time. So that's kind of how it went for me.
That's a great story.
Well, and so you were discipled, and you mentioned the group, the Navigators, had a big impact on your life. And then obviously that continued to have an impact because you actually went to work with them, and you still work with the Navigators till this day, right? So how did that happen, the employment with the Navigators?
Yeah. So the end of my junior year, felt a call to ministry and was deciding between going to seminary and going on staff with the Navigators, and visited different seminaries. And as I was discerning that call, went overseas to an overseas missions experience in Southeast Asia. God really just captured my heart for the lost and for missions, and led me to go on staff with the Navigators at that point. That was 22 years ago. Currently, I'm with Navigators Church Ministries, which is the branch of the Navigators that works with pastors and churches and helps them with disciple making and establishing a culture of disciple making in their church that spills out into their community. And so that's kind of where it started and where I am now.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, that's perfect, because that's what we want to talk to you about. And you've written a lot about this on your blog, and then discipleship.org. And one of the things I think that Navigators does really well, and that you do really well, you guys are all really good at breaking down things where they're understandable, and then also equipping people to actually do what they're supposed to do. And so
Hmm.
that's what we're excited about talking to you about today. And we're going to talk about the subject of disciple making. And the question is, you wrote about this recently.
Yeah.
What is disciple making? Because I mean, there's a lot of talk in kind of churchy circles today. There's a lot of conferences. There's a lot of books coming out with this in the title. And what I'm seeing, and I'm sure you're seeing, is that sometimes we're talking about different things, but we're just using the same words. So
Yeah.
can we just jump right into that and say, what is disciple making?
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like it should be an easy answer, right?
Yeah.
But as you alluded to, like disciple making and discipleship, it is such a popular phrase or words in the church today, and we mean different things by it.
Yep.
The Navigators has been at this for over 80 years now. And I was struck about 4 years ago when Bill Hall stood up at the National Disciple Making Forum and said he was so encouraged because in his entire life and ministry, he'd never seen disciple making take root in the church the way that it was at that point. And I think it's even grown since then.
Yeah.
But as I work with pastors and church leaders, especially early on, I'm in these conversations where I'm asking questions like, how's disciple making going in your church? What is your vision for your church? What's the goal for your church? And they'll use disciple making language back with me. But it very quickly, I realized that we're not speaking the same language. And so it's both a frustration for me and an opportunity, but it led me to really thinking in a precise manner, what do I mean when I talk about disciple making?
Mm-hmm.
And part of what I've come to is that there's some difficulty in definition for a few reasons. Right. So some truths that I think most of us hold to as we read the scriptures is that we are called to make disciples. Right. We talk about the Great Commission. Right. That's not just for the disciples. That's for all of us. So we're called to do it. But another complicating factor is that Jesus, God, the Holy Spirit, however we want to say that, is the one who grows disciples.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it's our calling and responsibility. But at the same time, he does it. And since he does it, we can reasonably expect that in every church or ministry, over a period of time, disciples will emerge, mature disciples will emerge. And so then the question is, well, are those mature disciples emerging because of what we're doing, in spite of what we're doing, or no relationship at all to what we're doing?
Yeah.
Right. And so it muddies some of the water. And the third thing that makes it difficult is that there are lots of ways to make a disciple. And so when I'm talking about making disciples, sometimes a pastor is talking to me, oh yeah, we make disciples. And what he means by that is he's preaching scripture each and every week.
Yeah.
Great thing to do, right?
Yeah.
Biblical. We have to do that. But that's not what I'm talking about, because there are lots of churches that are preaching faithfully through the scriptures, but aren't making reproducing disciples, right? And so those three things, right? It's our job, he grows them, and there's many ways to do it, makes this whole topic a little bit muddy, right? So that is kind of where I start with a pastor is like, okay, well, these things are true, but where I start, if I'm talking about disciple making, I'm talking about how did Jesus do it? So my one assumption that I'm going to start with is that Jesus's way of making a disciple is the best way.
Yeah.
And
That's
it
a good
seems
point.
obvious, right?
Sure.
That, well, we can trust that Jesus's way of doing it is the best way. And out of all the pastors I've talked to, I've only had one disagree with me about that. And that was an interesting conversation.
Can you give us his name and phone number, address?
Right. Yeah. So most pastors can get there with me. All right. So Jesus' way is the best way. But what we don't mean, we're not saying that we're all going to find 12 guys and wander around and sleep in the same place and eat every meal together and all that sort of stuff. I don't know anybody that's doing that.
Right. That
But
sounds
what
like
we-
a cool experiment, though.
Yeah, maybe for
research purposes.
for 3 weeks.
Yeah. 3 weeks.
That's right. Yeah. And so what we're trying to do is contextualize to our day and time the principles that underlie Jesus's way of making disciples. And so what are the ways that we do that? And so what I propose is that disciple making the way that Jesus did really involves three things, and that we can look for as we do this thing called disciple making. And the first one is that I believe disciple making is a specific type of relationship. Now, I mostly practice one-on-one disciple making. I don't think there's anything more biblical about that than one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three.
Yeah.
When we start getting bigger, it becomes difficult for me. And the way I kind of slice that is I'm trying to get as close as I can to the quality of relationship that Jesus had with his men. And I'm not so concerned with the form, right? And so the quality is what I'm after, but it's a specific type of relationship that's holistic. And so it's not just teacher student, it's not friend friend, it's all of these things together that this disciple making relationship is, right? So I have found that most disciple makers that end up making disciples the way that Jesus did are motivated in one of three ways. And this is a little bit of a hypothesis because I've been testing it out and asking questions, and I'm still asking that question. Well, why do you do this? And the three ways, the three primary motivations that I have found is first, Christological. And so it is a motivation. I just want to be like Jesus. I see that he is doing that. I want to be like him. He's asked me to do it. And so he's my example. I'm doing it. So that Christological motivation. Second motivation I've seen is what I call covenantal motivation. So if we look back at the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, where God comes to Abram and gives him this opportunity to follow. And in exchange for following and believing, he's going to make his descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. A really fun study that I've done is to trace that promise down through the Old Testament. And you can see it happen really clearly in Genesis. But then we get all the way out, and Paul talks about explicitly in Galatians 3. And he talks about how we are seeds we are Abraham's seed, heirs of that promise. I was first introduced to that idea when I was 21 years old, and I didn't know if it was true at the time. But I remember praying to God, God, if this is true, I want to use my life for this. I don't want to spend it for other things. I want to invest it for your kingdom. Would you do that for me?
Yeah.
That my spiritual descendants would be as numerous as the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky. And so some of us are really motivated by that idea of that participation. And then the third one is kind of a missional motivation, which is we see the lost, our hearts bleed for the lost. We see where this thing is going in God's kingdom, and we want to be a part of building it.
Yeah.
And a part of the solution so that people who are dying and going to hell don't have to do that.
Right.
And so I found it's really one of those three things that motivates disciple makers. And the thing about those three motivations is that none of them are primarily selfish. Right? Sometimes we talk about making disciples, and Dan, like you alluded to, it's like, well, I'm building my church, and so I need to make disciples because my church, and and it quickly veers a little bit off course from, no, this is Jesus's story. This is what God's doing throughout time and eternity, and I just want to play my part. Right? I want to serve in that.
You know, that brings up a question. You mentioned this kind of at the beginning, and it's something that I know Stephen deals with, I deal with, anybody who's part of the Bonhoeffer Project deals with, is these conversations with disciple-making leaders, or I'm sorry, with church leaders. And we talk the same language, but on the back end, it's almost as if we couldn't be further apart.
Yeah.
And I kind of want to drill down in that for just a moment.
Sure.
What do you think is causing that disconnect? Is it, I mean, obviously, I think it could probably be tons of different things that all kind of stack up on one another and become just a mountain of a problem. But what are you finding? Because I've got my own assumptions, but I just want to hear, like, because I hear that all the time, right? We'll talk the same thing, and then you'll ask one little question that seems to almost derail their entire ministry. And obviously, I don't want to do that without bringing some reparative work to it. But like,
Right.
what are you finding is the crux behind why disciple making is so misunderstood, or just there's a faulty execution?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I find that it comes back to definitions and also to what are we here to do?
Mm,
Yeah.
Meaning on earth, right? So
yeah.
I find a lot of times we ask this question as a Christian and we put the answer in the context of all eternity, which is helpful in some contexts, but I want to know, what am I here to do now in this small space of time that
Yeah.
I'm on earth here to do? And yeah, I'm here to glorify God and enjoy him forever. But right now, my call is a little bit more specific than that, because
Mm,
I am going to glorify God by participating in building his kingdom by making
yeah.
reproducing disciples. And so when we get to a place of believing that, well, the best thing I can do as an individual disciple is to grow and become mature, the focus is on me and bearing fruit. And I use the analogy of becoming like a Christmas tree, right? That everybody can look at me. Oh, how great of a Christian that
Yeah.
guy is. Look at him, his life. Oh, I wish we could be like him. That's not what God's calling us to, in my opinion. God's calling us to bear fruit that goes and reproduces, right? More like an
Yeah.
apple tree that's not that beautiful necessarily, but it's going to bear fruit that then grows other trees. And so that's one of the things that I think gets us off track as believers. And the other part is just, we just don't have clarity on what fruit is, what it means to make a disciple. And, you know, I vet pastors sometimes, or vet's the wrong word, but I ask the question of like, you know, how are you discipling anybody? Almost always they'll tell me yes.
Right.
And then I'll say, great, how many people are you discipling? And a lot of times they don't know. I don't know, quite a few. And I'll say, well, let's just write their names down. And so I'm writing down as they're saying them. And frequently I'll have guys that are listing 15 to 20 people.
Yeah.
And then I'll say with a smile on my face, that's really cool, because Jesus could only do 12 and he had all his time. How are you doing this? Right. And it becomes clear that we're talking about different things at
That's
that
right.
point. Right.
Yeah.
And so for many pastors, I think disciple making is simply helping a disciple grow and become more mature.
Yeah.
But the way in which they're doing that, there's very little clarity or in-depth thinking around what that looks like or what it means.
Mhm.
Right. And that's what I've seen. I've seen most of the growing, like you're talking about, is intellectual, right?
Yeah.
I know more. I can answer. I can play Bible Trivial Pursuit and win.
Right.
Therefore, I'm a better Christian.
Yeah.
When really, you know, so many of Jesus's examples are against the people who know a lot, right? Namely the Pharisees. It's
Yeah.
like, cool, you know everything, but you lack compassion, right?
Yeah.
You know all these things, yet you don't help people. Like,
Mhm.
Yeah.
I don't know if
Absolutely.
it's really about how much you know, and I think that you're nailing it in terms of what are we using the wisdom for? Is it to create more relationships and garner that long-lasting Galatians 5 type fruit?
Right.
Or are we just doing it to pat ourselves on the back and say, look how much I've grown?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah, Justin. So you mentioned that disciple making. What disciple making is it's a specific type of relationship.
Yeah.
But I think you also had some other points that you were going to share with us too.
Yeah. The second thing that I believe disciple making must involve is methods that are relational, intentional, and missional. And so again, I'll get there because Jesus's way is the best way. And when we look at Jesus's life, we see those key components in what he did and how he lived. And there are lots of books that unpack those sorts of things, right? The Master Plan of Evangelism being the gold standard of that by Robert E. Coleman. But today what I see is a lot of methods that are different than that. Methods that are primarily academic, kind of like you alluded to, Dan. Methods that are consumeristic, that are looking at what disciples or people in the church are asking for or need help with, and then, okay, well, let's help you with this, or so they're meeting those felt needs, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's not what Jesus did. Right. And the other one is a programmatic method, which is, getting people involved in programs that serve in some way, but don't equip, don't develop. Right. And so instead of helping them become something, which I think is a big part of disciple making, we're helping you become a disciple maker. We're just helping them be involved in something. Right. And there are some programs, and I'm not going to name them, but that enable people to feel as if they're serving and loving people without actually engaging with people, without actually bringing themselves into the equation or relating to them in any sort of way. And the result of that is not disciple making fruit. Right. And so that is the second thing that I talk about is it must be carried out with those methods: relational, intentional, and missional. And the missional being, we're reaching the lost. It doesn't just stay in with the church.
Yeah. Justin, I want to just drill down on this a little bit more. That I think that piece that you mentioned, relational, that's something we talk about it often on the podcast. But it seems to be the secret sauce, or at least that foundational building block to disciple making. But it also seems to be a difficult part for a lot of people. It seems to be the part that is hardest for people to define. It's the part that's hardest to measure sometimes. And for whatever reason, seems to be the piece that I think a lot of people don't want to do.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what do you think is the reason that we struggle with that as leaders or as a church? Is it lack of time? Is it an American culture? Is it a number of, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's primarily culture, which leads to that lack of time. But our culture is very consumeristic, and in a consumeristic culture, we have roles to play, and we prefer to play those roles. And so instead of friendships, we end up with what I call systemships. And so we enter into a system. We're a systems culture. We're born into a system. When we're born into a hospital, a lot of us will die in a system, whether it's a hospital or hospice or something, and lots of systems in between. And we kind of are near people as we move through these systems. But as soon as the systems and the structures of that system, as soon as we're out of it or those go away, the systemships go away. But loving people goes beyond that, right? And Jesus calls us to love. And so we haven't learned, many people, and I'm an introvert, so we have a harder time with this even than others, is that not only do we not know how to love, we're not even sure we want to love people. We're like, hey, sometimes I just want to be alone. And if I want to be around people, I'll jump into one of these systems and I'll get the feeling of being in relationship without even being vulnerable. Yeah. Right. And so that's a huge topic that I think is really important. But in churches, one of the things that we help people with and help pastors with sometimes is, how do we love people? Yeah. How do we get near them in such a way that, it requires some risk. It requires some vulnerability. And most of us aren't used to that. And we don't love the idea of doing those sorts of things. But as a result, we've insulated ourselves from really, truly being loved as well. So that's just a piece. I mean, that we could have a couple episodes on that.
That's a deep hole.
That was a super deep hole, because I even know this as pastors. I mean, every relationship we engage in is risky.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Because we don't know who's going to be the next person to leave us. Hurt us, falsely accuse us. And the same goes for every relationship we have within the church. And I love that systemship. Yeah. Right? That's good. It's what system are we, or what basket are we going to go into today? Yep. That hopefully doesn't have a funnel that takes us any deeper than just that surface level. Yeah. Because then I can have a checkbox. Yeah. As though I'm in a relationship. Yeah. Look, I'm in this home fellowship. That's never vulnerable with anyone. Yeah. Look, I went to this conference over here, but it's all I don't know, it's a facade
Yeah.
to a certain extent in terms of a deep, loving, abiding, lasting relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think at some point, like we're going to have to come back. This is a whole
Yeah, this
podcast.
is the next podcast we gotta talk.
Because especially with an American culture or a world that's coming out of a pandemic where we already were struggling with relationships, and then we were, in our caves for a year and a half, like we have no idea how to do relationships right now.
Your next book. This is what we need to drill down on. We got to figure out
System ships. I'm still in the title. But I want to make sure before we get to the end of the podcast, we leave time for you. There's one more point in your description of disciple making. I want to give you a chance to share that.
Yeah. The last one is Jesus style disciple making always leads to fruit that multiplies. Always leads to fruit that multiplies. And this is one of the things with pastors, one of the ways that we can distinguish what I'm talking about from what they're talking about. I had a pastor tell me once, Justin, I don't have any trouble making disciples. The problem I have is getting them to reproduce. And I didn't say at the time, but I was thinking, I said, it's like saying I have no trouble making a chair. The problem I have is when people sit in it. Right. And I didn't say at the time. That's what I'm thinking. It's what he's saying, right?
He's listening to the podcast, though.
He might be. The whole point, Jesus is making these men to know Jesus, but also so that they'll go out and reproduce, right? And so the multiplication that we're looking for is three things. And the first thing is multiplication in the form of new converts, right? So new disciples, reaching the lost, not just reaching those in the church.
That's right.
New disciples. The second thing we need to look for is new disciple makers. So as they grow and develop, they should be doing what we're doing. And the third one is a three-dimensional momentum that moves outward to the lost, into the church, and downward in the life of a believer. Again, that's outward to the lost, into the church, and down in the life of a believer. And so healthy disciple making reproduces and multiplies all those things. And so as I'm making disciples and helping churches do that, I'm looking for those things and bringing those things up and saying, hey, these are markers that we can look to know whether what we're doing is really what Jesus did, because healthy disciple making is going to multiply in those ways.
I think that's huge. And just setting that target for what we're going for, because I do think that's probably a lot of our confusion, right? When we say disciple making or we say disciple, it's like, well, what are we going for? Are we going for people who come to church a couple more times a month? Show.
Right. That's the majority of the American church is teaching people your mission is to come back next week.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. And then what? Do it again.
Right.
Right. And then
to join a volunteer team.
Oh, yeah.
Because we need you. We need you in kids.
Yeah. But that is, and we've created this false sense of disciple making in churches. Like you said, that's a great analogy with the chair. Like, make the chair. But the problem is people can't sit in it because it breaks every time. It's like, then you need to probably go back to the drawing board and look at maybe some plans of making a chair that's robust and strong, suited for sitting in. I think that's phenomenal. But there's a lot to unpack there. And again, I think especially for church leaders, coming back to that understanding that we are called to make disciples, and a key, if not the most essential component of disciple making, is that a disciple makes more disciples. It's one of the things that I've always I kind of relegated my questioning back to how do you know if you made one? Right. That's the question that I usually ask pastors. They say, oh, I'm making disciples. Well, how do you know when they're finished? Right. How do you know when they've arrived? And they really don't have this answer. And the funny part is too, discipleship is, we're a disciple the moment we start following Christ, and we're also not yet perfected because sanctification takes until he comes. So it's not yet, but yes, already, right? There's these kind of dynamics playing in there. But I've yet to find a pastor, kind of what your point, Justin, I've yet to find a pastor that says, well, I define a disciple as one who then goes and makes more disciples. Because they're looking for an arrival, a point of destination, and almost like a finality, a finish line, an arrival, but then there's no more work. It's I've got the badge in my pocket, And now, okay, now I'm going to just sit back and go to another Bible study
Yeah.
and get more knowledge
Mm-hmm.
and show people how smart I am. And that's never going
Which
to
is
be the fruit that needs to multiply in our churches.
Yeah.
right.
Amen. Amen. Well, Justin, thanks so much for joining us here today. Really appreciate that. If you guys want more information on Justin and his ministry, you can check out his website, Justin Gravitt. That's 2 T's at the end of Gravitt, justingravitt.com. If you want more information about the Bonhoeffer Project, you can go to bonhoefferproject.com as well. Once again, thank you, Justin. Thank you, Stephen, for being here as well. And to all of you listening, as we always say, make disciples and let Jesus build the church. God bless you guys. We'll see you on the next one.